Hey guys, Jake from the future here. Before I start today's video comparing these two absolute beasts, I just wanted to remind you guys that if you like my content, remember to like and subscribe, or simply just share my content around. It's the easiest way that you can support me, and it really does go a long way. Another way that you could support me is by giving me a donation through the links below to my Ko-fi account, or, and this is probably the best way that you can support what it is that I do, send me one of your cameras my way so that I may upgrade it and build something awesome and custom for you, such as the camera that will feature in today's video. Polaroid I-2 versus the SX-70R converted SX-70 with lithium-ion battery modification, the Polaroid. This is a video that I'm doing because you guys asked me for a bit of a comparison between an SX-70 type camera and the Polaroid I-2. Now, initially, my thought was to do a comparison, pretty much comparing the Polaroid I-2 with what would realistically be the most similar camera, and that would have been a modified SLR680 with the SX-70R Bluetooth PCB, because these on paper, I guess, are the most similar to one another. Automatic focusing, built-in flash, high-performance lens, manual control of settings, built-in self-timers, etc. They're both even black. But have you seen the price of SLR680s these days? It's a little ridiculous. So I didn't think it would be fair to compare the 680 to a new camera that is basically half the price. So I decided to disqualify the 680 from the competition. And instead, we'll be comparing it to the SX-70 Sonar. Here I have one that I made for a client of mine. It is going to be shipped all the way off to Europe as soon as I'm finished with this other camera. But this camera, other than lacking a built-in flash, which we could use a Mint flash bar to get around, has pretty much the exact same specifications that I just gave you. It's modified with the SX-70R PCB. It contains lithium-ion batteries in the form of my Polaroid adapter that power the camera and allow it to take I-type film. And through the use of the dedicated dongle, or if you didn't want to purchase the dongle and you wanted to use your phone instead and use a dedicated app, you get manual control of all the settings. They are pretty similar overall. But the truth of the matter is, when I started shooting this comparison video, I realized that other than those similarities that I just mentioned, these two are drastically different beasts to shoot with. And I'd really like to emphasize that before I dive too much deeper into the video. This is like comparing, I don't know, like a car versus a motorcycle, right? Like, this is like comparing a high-performance sports car against a high-performance motorcycle. That's the best analogy I can come up with, and that they both go really fast and both have great performance, but boy oh boy will they get you there differently. Because the truth of the matter is, this camera here is an SLR. If you don't know what that means, well, allow me to explain. It basically means that when you look through the viewfinder, you're effectively looking through the lens. Light is bouncing from the lens off a series of mirrors and screens through the viewfinder itself. This camera is basically a viewfinder camera. Now, I've heard people online describe this as a rangefinder camera. I wouldn't strictly call it a rangefinder because the optical assembly doesn't do any range finding. It does use LiDAR, which sort of works like a rangefinder, but there's no overlapping images in the viewfinder display, although you do get a distance reading. And the very fact that they are completely different styles of camera, for me, made them very hard to compare, because it really is apples and oranges. As someone that shot with SLR Polaroids pretty much exclusively in terms of integral film, I find it very hard to go back to a box camera, even if it is a very high performance box camera, because once you've seen through the lens of one of these and get that sort of, you know, what do they call it? WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, perspective through the SLR viewfinder, nothing really compares. But I figured I would do a comparison video anyway. But in the video, I want to try and talk more about the actual performance of the cameras and the photos, rather than just outright doing a comparison of specs and how they handle and that kind of thing, because honestly, they're just so different that I would find it hard to really give an accurate perspective on which one is better, because they're too different for that. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it. But one of the interesting things that I will talk about, and it comes up a lot, I've been pretty vocal on some of my criticisms of the Polaroid I-1, particularly its built-in battery. And that's why when I came up with my own I-type solution, I chose to have batteries that you could easily use or replace in the field. But one of the biggest advantages that people talk about when it comes to the Polaroid I-1 is the fact that you get true control over manual and shutter speed. And I think that's really where this camera shines, is you do get 100% control over manual shutter speed and manual aperture. It does have an automatic mode, but I mean, my direct experience with it, and a lot of people's direct experience with it, is the auto mode on this camera is a little bit, it's a little bit meh, as we'll see in a minute. But as I said, one of the real things that people say is a huge selling point for the i2 is true control over both aperture and shutter speed when you're shooting manual. Whereas on the SX-70R PCB, you get effective shutter speeds, which I dived very deep in my video on the SX-70R series of cameras. But again, basically, when it comes to manually shooting with one of these, f8 is going to be your reference, and then it tells you an effective shutter speed. And the reason that I say effective is because the SX-70 has a combined blade design that combines aperture and shutter speed into one EV value. Again, I've gone way more into depth in that in the video that I did talking about the SX-70R and how it works. But the long end of the short version of a very long story is basically that it's impossible on an SX-70 camera, and it's not just because of the PCB upgrade, it's just because of the shutter's design. It only has two blades. You cannot truly separate shutter speed and aperture. Basically, the faster you make a shutter speed on an SX-70, the smaller the aperture is going to be used. So while it may say on the tin, so to speak, that you're shooting at, f8 1/2000th, in reality it's more like, 1/200th of a second f22, something like that. And those very vocal about the manual control of the i2 have criticized the SX-70 for not having that true control. So what I sought out to answer in this video is not only was the image quality of the two comparable, but does that manual control of aperture and shutter speed truly matter? And where I'm coming from with that point is the i2 has a maximum shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. Its maximum aperture is f8. Meaning, if you want to shoot wide open all the time, well, you better be doing so in a scene that, only needs up to 1/250th of a second, because if we're shooting I-type film, which is 640 ISO, well, if you're shooting on a bright sunny day, it's just not going to be possible unless you use, of course, some kind of ND filter over the lens. And if you're using ND filters over the lens, then I would argue that, well, the whole shutter system is moot, because you could get any number of filter materials to put over the SX-70 lenses in comparison. But I digress. You only get a top speed of 1/250th of a second. And so that means that when you are shooting in natural light where you can have the lens wide open, you start to get suspiciously close to the same aperture values that the SX-70 would be using for the same scene. Does that make sense? So if you're in a very bright scene, the SX-70 could be using an aperture equivalent of, f22, f32. But the fact that the shutter speed on this only goes up to 1/250th of a second means that that's kind of the case with this camera too, if you're shooting in a very bright sunny scene. So I'd argue, is shooting wide open at f8 all that important when the film speed is 640 ISO? Now, of course, you could shoot SX-70 film, or you could put filters over the lenses on both cameras. But, now we start talking about a whole different game, right? And the other point that I wanted to bring up, which no one seems to be talking about in terms of comparing Polaroid's former flagship camera with their current flagship camera, is the fact that these lenses are radically different focal lengths. The SX-70 has a much longer focal length of 116 millimeters, whilst the I-2 boasts a wider 98 millimeters. In fact, that makes the I-2 wider than any other box-type camera produced by Polaroid other than the Spectra Pro Cam, which had a 90 millimeter lens. So she's pretty wide in comparison to the SLR models. Now, I know many of you might be thinking, well, that's not even a 20 millimeter difference, right? 116 versus 98 millimeters. But it's difference enough. What you'll tend to notice for any given scene, the SX-70, to sort of get the same area framed in your shot, I typically found with the Polaroid I-2 that I had to step 1 foot extra into frame to get the scene to be roughly the same between both cameras. Otherwise, the I-2 looked a lot wider. And where I'm going with this is, when you have a longer lens, so when you have, say, 116 millimeters comparative to 98 millimeters, the depth of field is much shallower because of the longer lens. Okay, well, maybe it's not ridiculously shallower, but when we're talking about what is effectively large format film, that extra 18 millimeters or so makes quite the difference. And the fact is that wide open, the SX-70 at true f8 will have a shallower depth of field than the I-2. So the reason that I bring this up is, these days in photography, what aperture typically means is, what kind of bokeh am I going to get? What kind of subject separation am I going to get? Whilst, yes, I would say that, some people might have reason for shooting at much smaller apertures, such as, for example, if they want to get both the foreground and the background at around the same level of sharpness. Let's face it here, most photographers, when they're talking about changing aperture on cameras, are after one thing. How wide can I get it? How shallow can I get that depth of field, baby? Where's the bokeh at? That's really all. Let's face it here, and I know a lot of you are going to say, I'm feeling personally attacked right now, but that's what modern photography and gear comparisons have become. It's all about the bokeh, as Kai from DRTV would have said back in the day. That's a throwback to anyone that was watching camera YouTube a decade ago. But yeah, I want to now do a comparison, just talking about some of the images, because I compared both of these cameras in automatic mode, and then I specifically compared the cameras in manual mode, using manual effective speeds and true f8, because I wanted to see what was the difference in terms of background blur, bokeh, subject separation. I wanted to really get a good idea of just what the difference meant. So I think I've waffled on for long enough. Let's get into some photos. Now, as I did before in my last comparison video, what I'm going to be doing here is just showing you guys live on camera rather than doing any kind of scans. Reason being is then, well, you can't accuse me of doctoring any of the images. And there's going to be nothing, basically nothing in the images that the scanner has, rectified, like color shifts or anything like that. So I just think it's a bit of a fairer way to do a comparison. So we're going to start with some photos of Alf, my plush toy from, I guess, the late 1980s, early 1990s. And over on the left here, we have the SX-70R. Over on the right here, we have the Polaroid I-2. Now, I chose this setting because basically it lets us see two things. The first being, what is the background looking like in terms of blur? Because we've got some foliage, and if you guys look closely, you can see some bricks in the background. And secondly, it lets us notice what's the difference in terms of that lens focal length. Because taking this photo, I stayed roughly the same distance away from the subject. So my feet were fixed in place. So I'm the same distance from Alf here, but you can see the difference that extra 20 meters of focal length gives. The SX-70 looks far closer. I would say that this is probably a nicer portrait focal length if we were taking Alf's portrait here. Whereas here you can definitely see that wider lens giving much more of the background some attention. These settings were taken, so this was 1/60th of a second at f8, and of course this was taken at the same, except we know that the SX-70 isn't truly capable of 1/60th of a second. It's shooting probably something like f11 or f16 here in this photo. But the thing that I'd like to draw your attention to, sharpness for both images is roughly the same. After all, Alf is pretty much front and center and takes up mainly the center of the image, with the rest of the background falling off and becoming bokeh. But the sharpness is very much on par. I would be happy with either of these in terms of sharpness. The background blur, however, if we look, we'll note that it's pretty darn similar. We still get blurred out leaves and things like that, and that's because although the SX-70 stops down the aperture slightly, it's making up for that by having a longer focal length. So the similarity, I think, is really, really obvious in terms of the blur. So what I'm trying to get at here is that whilst you do get true f8 using the I-2, the longer focal length of the SX-70 means that it doesn't really matter if your only priority is subject isolation. If you're after that sort of blurry, creamy bokeh background for portraits, well, the SX-70's lens, just being slightly longer, gives you a shallower depth of field anyway. So I would say, image-wise, these two are pretty similar. Now, I revisited Alf in another set of photos, but this time I tried to make the framing as similar as I could. So what I did here is focusing using the SX-70. I then tried to replicate that by moving in around a foot to make up for the I-2's wider lens. And again, here we see just what a difference it makes in terms of that lens focal length difference. Whilst it's not exactly fisheye, we can certainly tell from the shape of the image, well, I guess like the shape of the boxes and things like that Alf is sitting on, that Alf had his photo taken here with a wider angle lens. And I will admit the background isn't exactly the same here. I guess I got the angle wrong, but the angle I got wrong because The viewfinder lens on the Polaroid I-2 makes it a lot harder to compose with. Now, I will admit that I could probably get used to that over some time. I was using the parallax correction viewfinder built into the Polaroid I-2, but I think I'd have to spend a lot of time getting to know the camera quite intimately well to be able to compensate for that. Whereas, obviously, with the SX-70, I was able to reproduce it fairly accurately. You know, these are near on the same image. But yeah, again, the background is sufficiently blurred. Obviously, we're getting a true f8 here. Here we're getting maybe f11 or f16, something closer to that. But it doesn't really matter. For the type of environment where you're shooting this wide anyway, it doesn't make so much of a difference. So, well, all right. I get what you're saying, Jake. I hear you say snarkily at your screen. But what about when the sun comes out, maybe when you start to max out at around 1/250th of a second? How about your f8 then? Because your SX-70 is going to stop down the lens a heck of a lot more. So surely the depth of field will be different then. Well, let's see. Slightly different photo. But again, here we have the SX-70R taken at 1/250th of a second. And here we have the I-2 doing its true f8 1/250th of a second. The background is certainly a touch sharper on the SX-70 image. Is it that much sharper? And does it detract away from the photo? I don't think so. They look pretty similar if you ask me. But yeah, certainly here we can see the I-2 has the advantage if you want that subject separation. Now, obviously I'm taking a photo of a car here, even if it is a very small car. And so the subject separation would have been greater had I had, you know, some kind of outdoor podium to put Alf on. But honestly, here in the Australian summer and around my house, I just couldn't find the right lighting where it wasn't going to be completely blown out. But again, what I'm trying to say is for normal picture taking, because I was having a chat with someone the other day who really likes the I-2, and they said that they basically leave it on f8 all the time to try and get that shallower depth of field. All I'm trying to point out is it's like not that much shallower, but certainly I can see it. But yeah, you would need to be in a very specific, I guess, lighting environment where you can shoot f8 at 1/250th of a second. Now, I alluded before in the introduction to the video, could you use ND filters to trick the camera and shoot wider apertures? Well, yes, you could, but that involves adding extra accessories. I want to simplify things and talk about just purely having only the camera at hand, because if we start bringing ND filters into this conversation, well, you know, we could do all kinds of crazy things with them. But yeah, here really demonstrates the I-2 certainly has a shallower depth of field, but again, the longer lens of the SX-70 kind of makes up for that. You can see here as well, I tried to frame the car as accurately as I could between the two cameras. There's a little bit of car, like the car to edge ratio on the Mini Moke here has a bit of a gap. It's a bit more consistent because I use the SLR, but overall, a pretty similar image. I'm quite happy with that. So let's talk a bit about close-up then. Again, we're on manual mode, so I've got two more here. Now this is in a lighting scenario which was far more dim. This is internally in a bathroom, and what we're shooting here, this is about 1/10 of a second, which means for an SX-70, you are certainly going to get true f8. If you're shooting as slow as 1/10, you're definitely getting the full aperture experience on an SX-70. And so here we see two photos of my friend Ashley's camera, taken at basically the same distance. I tried to keep this as accurate as possible, of course, while doing it handheld. We can see, again, the I-2 slightly wider. The subject, being the camera, looks slightly further away as a result of that. And the camera slightly off-center again, just because it's not an SLR viewfinder, composing the images a little bit harder with a box camera. This dark stripe has nothing to do with the Polaroid I-2. That is simply a film issue. so we can just ignore that for the sake of the video. Performance, pretty similar between both, but the SX-70 photo here actually has a slightly shallower depth of field, given the difference between the camera and the pot plant. The pot plant in this photo is ever so slightly sharper, whereas here the subject and separation is a little bit greater because of that extra 18 millimeters or so in focal length. So enough about manual aperture. How about comparing the cameras on automatic mode? Well, I always love these comparisons. And for the sake of these comparisons, I also decided to chuck in a Polaroid I-1 into the mix, because I happen to have one on hand that I needed to film test anyway. So here we have an SX-70. Now, I specifically tried a very challenging scene to see how the light meter would react. Here we have the Polaroid I-2, and then here the Polaroid I-1. Now again, this film is possibly a little bit heat damaged. It is very hot here in Australia at the moment, and I think this batch was a little bit affected, so just try and ignore the blue bar. Focus mainly on sharpness of the images and focus mainly on exposure. The I-2, true to its reputation, tended to expose the image a little brighter, whereas the SX-70, I think, did a fair job of capturing the black versus the light. This is not unacceptable though, and the extra brightness in the shadows does allow us to appreciate that super sharp corner-to-corner sharpness that the I-2 lens has. The standout for me though happened to be the Polaroid I-1, which honestly surprised me. It was a lot harder to frame the photo because the I-1, I think, might win the award for the worst viewfinder ever put on a Polaroid camera ever. Tell me in the comments below if you think there was anything worse than the I-1's viewfinder. I don't think there is. But exposure was very accurate. Again, I think some of that though is the fact that I cut the sky off because the I-1 is just so difficult to compose with. But yeah, you can certainly see the difference. And as I said before, this was not a very fair scene to compare. This is incredibly tricky for any camera. I just wanted to see what kind of a job it would do. And I think it did an okay job. All the important bits of the information are there. Let's go on to the next photo, which will feature two main shots from the SX-70R and the Polaroid I-2, with a bonus coming in from the I-1. So, first of all, we have the SX-70R, followed by the I-2, and look, I'll give the I-1 a shot here, but again, the framing was just so off. It was like off to the side because the viewfinder is just so hopeless on the Polaroid I-1. But again, similar story as before. I would say that metering-wise, the SX-70 and the Impossible Project I-1, I keep saying Polaroid, but it's the Impossible Project I-1, did a really good job. The I-2, again, seemed to be just that little bit more overexposing when it's set to the middle mode. Now, one of the reasons for that may be because the Polaroid I-2 seems to be quite center-weighted, like it seems to really focus a lot of the attention on whatever is right in the center of the image. And at least in this corner of a house that I took a photo with, the center part of the image was the part that had the most shadows. This was an incredibly bright sunny day where I took this photo. And if the image is very center-weighted on the Polaroid I-2, then that could explain why it seemed to expose for the shadows on the side of the house, rather than an averaged meter of the entire scene. But yeah, I'm going to give it to the SX-70R on automatic mode for this. The I-2 is not offensive. It's just that the I-1 metered a little bit better, even if it was way harder to aim because the viewfinder is just so garbage. Another set of photos that I decided to take was through the window of an abandoned church that is down the road from me. And here, I think, again, we see a lot more clues that the Polaroid I-2 might have a very center-weighted electric eye. This is what the SX-70R gave us. That was the Polaroid I-2. and this was the Polaroid I-1. Again, the I-1 is the worst framed. Oh, I said it again, the impossible I-1. The I-1, certainly the worst framed because the viewfinder is just hopeless, as I said before. But let's check out the difference between these two photos. These were both shot on automatic mode. And, I mean, at least to me, it seems like the SX-70R's PCB has taken quite an averaged out reading of the room. We've got the very bright sunlight coming in from the hallway, but we've also got the dark carpet, sunlight coming in from the side, and sunlight being reflected off the tiled walls and the roof. Whereas the I-2 seems to have taken most of its reading from the center of the image where the bright door is, and as a result has made the rest of the image rather dark. So I'm getting a hunch that when you're using the Polaroid I-2, it's quite center weighted. Either that or the SX-70R PCB with its modern electric eye is just quite good at reading an average of the scene. The last photos I want to leave you with are some portraits, again taken on automatic mode. So again, on the left we have the SX-70R PCB, on the right we have the Polaroid I-2. Now I tried to keep my friend Ashley here as accurately framed as possible. I do believe with the I-2 I probably stepped a few too many feet too close, so she does appear a little bit closer here than in the SX-70 photo. But the interesting thing for me with this photo is less to do with the exposure and more to do with the SX-70 just seems to have done a much sharper job of the photo. Whereas if you actually look closely, my friend here is a little out of focus. Like, I'm not sure if the I-2 focused mainly on the wall behind her, but certainly, like if you pull out a loop, and I don't think I'll be able to capture this on camera. Maybe I will? Here we go, look at that. She's much sharper in the SX-70 photo than on the I-2 photo. I don't know if that magnifying loop is really going to show up all that well, but trust me, in person there's quite a big difference. And I don't know if it's because the autofocus missed her or if it misjudged, because certainly the I-2 should have the superior lens. Last photos I wanted to show are two closer portraits. Left taken with the SX-70R, again in automatic mode. Right using the I-2. Same distance this time, I planted my feet firmly in the same location. And again, the I-2 going for its classic slightly overexposed style. This, I would say, is a quintessentially perfect portrait. It's nailed exposure, super sharp, super crisp, nice background separation. There's nice background separation in most of them. Now, I believe that even though I did set this thing to auto, it was shooting pretty close to being wide open anyway. I think from memory it was around f11, it said, in the viewfinder display. But again, both quite nice. I will give the win to the SX-70R here, purely because I think if anything, the take-home message from this video, the extra few millimeters really make a difference if portraits are your thing. And of course, you can get accessory portrait lenses for the SX-70 as well. I don't believe telephoto lenses would work all that well with the Polaroid I-2. Being that it's autofocus, I think changing the effective focus of the lens would also throw off the autofocus mechanism, and so that the images would be blurry. So, yeah, while the I-2 might offer a true f8 experience for subject separation, I think the longer focal length does enough of that for you to make it a point that's kind of moot. So where do we end up with all of this? I don't know, they're such different cameras. Like, they're so hard to compare. I found it so impossible to try and compare this thing with this thing. I mean, on paper, they're so similar, but in practice, when it comes to using them, they're just radically different experiences. And the main thing that I've learned is just that, like, I think box-type cameras, for me, are more of a fun snapshot camera. where, like, let's say I was going to a party and I knew I might have a few drinks and I wanted to make things easier to use, I would probably take a box camera with a built-in flash just to make it easier on myself. But if I wanted to take a proper photo, for me, the SLR series is going to win hands down purely just because of that viewfinder and the fact that that lens is that little bit longer and slightly nicer for portraits. For me, that makes up for any, lack of true manual settings. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that, again, the reason that I compared the SX-70 Sonar to the i2 was because the price of secondhand SLR 680s has become rather ridiculous in the secondhand market just for that built-in flash. What I recommend, if you find a 680 for cheap, by all means go and buy it. But buying yourself a mint flash bar that you can just simply insert is another good option too, because it only adds about an extra $150 on top of the price tag, whereas the price increase to go from an SX-70 Sonar to a 680 is quite the jump. It's actually quite ludicrous. And these two cameras in their current specifications, so the SX-70 Sonar upgraded to the manual control Bluetooth PCB with my Polaroid lithium-ion battery mod to allow it to take I-type film, brings the price very comparatively close to the Polaroid I-2. Now, that includes purchasing a second-hand sonar, sending it to a technician such as myself for a full overhaul, getting a competent technician such as myself to install the PCB and calibrate it, and then having a competent technician come up with a I-type solution, puts these two in roughly the same ballpark in terms of price. Now, adding a mint flash bar and you may be an extra $100 or so ahead of the i2, but they're pretty similar. Now, as for what camera is best for you, it really depends. For me, as someone that wants a lot of control, but also just a camera with a cool design that is also an SLR, I think the SX-70 series is just simply always going to win. It is truly a camera without peers. And I don't think we're going to see any kind of SLR competitor to the SX-70 for a long time, because to produce something like this in the modern day and age, I think would be insanely expensive. But the i2, I can see the appeal. I mean, the first bit of appeal is, well, you can just pick one up brand new from a place like B&H Photo or in a store and unbox it and away you go. You don't have to track down an old camera. You don't have to send it away to get fixed. But it's all swings and roundabouts. The truth of the matter is this SX-70, despite being 40 or 50 years old, is still very repairable. And although Polaroid are now supplying parts for the i2, things like the battery are still very problematic. And the fact that you have to dismantle it down to the chassis to access it and swap it, and the fact that that's like a 2 to 3 hour job, I think is a little bit ridiculous when so many off-the-shelf lithium-ion batteries exist that cost relatively nothing. Like these are literally 10 Australian dollars for 2 of these batteries, and you can buy as many as you could fit in your backpack to have spares if you really wanted to, walk around with this thing all day, shoot it until it was literally dry, and then swap them in the field. So, what should you do? Well, I don't know. I'm not you. If I was me, and I am me, well, I know what I'd be choosing, but only you can really answer this question in terms of what's right for you. The i2 does have a lot going for it. As I said in my video where I harped on for 20 odd minutes criticizing the battery, the more I got to use the i2, the more I was quite impressed with it from a performance perspective. It does tick a lot of boxes, and ultimately I quite like it as a camera. But I don't know, is it the second coming that people made it out to be? That I'm less convinced. And what I am convinced about is you really just can't compare these things. They're so damn different. Like, they're radically different shooting experiences to the point where I almost didn't really want to make this video, but I know you guys like these comparison videos, so I want to try and produce this type of content. So I think that's about all I really wanted to say on the topic. Obviously, my comparisons here were not super scientific. I just wanted to highlight a few theoretical differences between the two cameras that hadn't been mentioned yet. Because I know the biggest criticism to any of the manual conversion SX-70s, whether it's the Mint Time Machine, whether it's the SX-70R, whether it's the Open SX-70 project, I know one of the biggest criticisms has been that you don't get that true aperture and shutter separation. But honestly, I don't think that's really such a big deal when you consider how the camera actually, like, how it is to shoot with one of these, if you get what I'm saying. So yeah, I don't know. What are your opinions? Leave them in the comments below. This was sort of a free-form video with no real flow, but I wanted to get something like this out there. As always, I love you guys. Thank you so much for the support. You're an absolutely wonderful audience, and I will see you in the next video.